on mute during the paper, and please add your name and affiliation into the chat. The seminar paper this evening will last approximately 50 minutes, after which the virtual floor is open to questions. During the Q&A, please raise your hand using the hand function on the top bar of the screen or write in the chat. Please keep your video on, as it is nice for the speaker to see your faces. And finally, this is a note to say that the seminar will be recorded and uploaded to the Project Vimeo site, details of which will be put in the chat. Finally, before I say a few words of introduction to our speaker tonight, I would like to introduce you to our colleagues on this project, Dr. Jonathan Beale, academic visitor to St Antony's College and lead researcher and teacher of philosophy at Sevenoaks School in Kent, and Luana de Borst, our research assistant, who holds an MSc in International and Comparative Education from the University of Oxford. Through John and Luana, this project has built connections with other human flourishing centres, such as the Human Flourishing Centre at Harvard and the Wellbeing Research Centre in Oxford, two important centres on topics relating to human flourishing. We would also like to extend our thanks to the Templeton World Charity Foundation, who have generously funded this research project. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this seminar series explores how we might better understand the idea, or indeed the ideal, of flourishing, and the importance of education as a pathway to it. Previously, in last year's seminar series, we examined a variety of important concepts concerning personhood and society as it relates to flourishing, such as character and virtue, and asked whether flourishing lies in the development of these. In this second seminar series, we turn our attention to other notions interdependently related to flourishing, specifically the notions of culture and context. In simple terms, we ask whether and how the development of mind and social-emotional qualities such as character, virtue, open-mindedness, resilience, and actualisation are differently, but no less meaningfully, shaped by history and culture across world contexts. We are very excited to open our new series of seminars with a paper from Dr. David Johnson, who is the project director for this research project. David is a man of many parts. Originally from South Africa, his early academic journey was marked with activism against the then apartheid regime, in which he endured incarceration, torture, and exile. Living in Botswana, then Zimbabwe, he came to the UK and moved to Oxford in 2003, where he is now University Reader in Comparative and International Education and a Professorial Fellow of St Antony's College. He is a chartered educational psychologist, and his research on culture, learning, and cognition has concentrated largely on Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. In addition to his academic work, David has held a number of senior public and university appointments. He is currently serving as junior proctor at Oxford University, one of the senior officers and trustees of the university, responsible for scrutiny of university committees, discipline, welfare, and which also has ceremonial functions. David, over to you and your paper on history, mind, and culture, shaping human flourishing across diverse contexts.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for that introduction. I'll get straight into it. We've lost a little bit of time on the technology, and apologies for that. I'm probably going to, I laid my hands over the weekend on a text that I hadn't consulted for some time, but this might help to put a few things that I want to talk about this evening into perspective. So I have the book here. It's Special Reports on Educational Subjects in the Educational Systems of the Chief Crown Colonies and possessions of the British Empire, including reports on the training of native races. And so this book is really compiled by reports of inspectors across many parts of what we now know, of course, as Australia, really, but also South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa, and a number of things, as they often do when I look at these documents on education, give me cause for pause and reflection, and sometimes a little bit of humor, in a sense, which really, I suppose, marks my own character or set of virtues, things that people who work on flourishing would come to recognize. Some of the language used and some of the perspectives we could take a great deal of umbrage with, or kind of shrug it off and say that it is really that kind of history and perspective that continues to offer meaningful contradictions. The only tool that I would argue allows us to go, that allows us to go forward. But I just wanted to read one or two things from this. I just sort of turned to the page on industrial schools and school gardens in Ceylon. Ceylon, of course, is now Sri Lanka. And this is a reflection of the inspector of schools in the 1900s. And because my paper is going to be looking at questions such as activity as an aspect of human flourishing, and we look at Aristotle and the arguments there, but also, of course, what our seminar series tries to do is to look at education, and we ask whether education is an enabler of well-being or of human flourishing, indeed a precondition or a necessary condition or an important factor, whatever our perspective is. But sometimes we treat education unproblematically, and sometimes we ignore the historical trajectories of education in different parts of the world. So this inspector writes really in argument, and we have students who are reading comparative and international education, in argument against the fact that we should simply copy things or adopt things holistically. She says, Samuel Smiles, whose charming books are so familiar to many of us, has said, "Honorable industry travels the same road with duty, and provenance has closely linked both with happiness. Certain it is that no bread eaten by man is so sweet that is earned by his own labor, whether bodily or mental. By labor, the earth is subdued and man redeemed from barbarism, nor has single step in civilization been made without it. Labor is not only a necessity and a duty, but a blessing. Only the idler feels it is not it to be a curse. So in the school of labor is taught the best practical wisdom, nor is it a life of manual employment incompatible with higher mental culture." She goes on and makes a lot of argument about the foolishness of the school curriculum, the vocational school curriculum then, to teach girls needlework or embroidery. And this is, of course, as it was Ceylon or Sri Lanka, arguing indeed for many different things in the curriculum, including argument about school gardens in Ceylon and what is then planted and so on. And I won't dwell too much on that, but this is from a missive on the the education of the Indians of Canada in the same book. How to educate to lead up to a higher intellectual, social, and moral standard. The Aboriginal, or as we like to call them, the inferior races, is always a problem of no little complexity. The difficulty varies partly with the motives and the ideas with which we set out to attempt that object, and partly with the natural habits and the environments of the people themselves. So in the most distant tropical countries where the Aborigines, when first brought into contact with the white man, were more or less in a state of barbarism, where there was no white permanently resident population with whom they may be brought into business competition or social comparison, where consequently they can be treated as a separate unit. The problem is a comparatively easy one, and so on and so forth. So why am I boring you with these texts from these historical texts? It's simply to make the point of the importance of the trajectory of education historically. And so for when we turn to look at the subject, the topic of flourishing, many people start, of course, at a very important historical junction. They turn to Aristotle and they say, well, if Aristotle in his works sort of said that education is ultimately the core driver of human flourishing, and the debate then goes on in terms of what flourishing is, whether it is an individual mental activity to do with mind. There's very little debate about education as an industry itself, its own historical importance, how it was shaped, and what indeed has shaped education in the manner in which it ultimately has been and still is being shaped. And therefore, as Fiona said, as we move from last year, where we spent quite a lot of time trying to understand and to unravel what is still quite a fluid concept of human flourishing. For psychologists, it means things that are perhaps very different to, say, health and well-being. People who might define flourishing as ultimately outcomes of an economic sort or of a health kind. For philosophers, flourishing is probably a little less tenuous, but the debates and the arguments about what it ultimately is, continues to exercise us. But in those exercises, I'm afraid the externalities like culture and history, and certainly the different contexts in which education is given or not, and indeed the external forces that control and shape the type of education that has been and is still being given, is often not taken into account in the sphere that the debate on flourishing takes place. This is not to say that these debates don't take place, but they certainly they take place in spheres elsewhere in the academic literature. So if you turn, for example, to texts on the politics of education or development studies, one might come across these debates in quite upfront in terms of externalities, but these are not necessarily papers that would refer to human flourishing as either an outcome or a process or a variable that is studied. So education in its study and in the orientation of its study through political economy, through anthropology, through philosophy, through psychology, the psychology of education, the philosophy of education, etc., are increasingly growing apart, even as we try to bring them somehow together. And what I think we want to do in this seminar series this term is really to foreground, and this is not through attempting to background the question of mine or individual capabilities, individual perspectives on human flourishing or the flourishing of individuals, as it were, the work of positive psychology and many other fields. We had a good attempt last year to look at where those debates are, what is problematic about them, where the gaps are, and how we can take it further. And this term, we really want to bring in what perhaps is the an accompanying side to that debate. And it's quite interesting, in preparation for this paper, I then looked again at those who Aristotelians who write with Aristotle as a driver, and actually, Aristotle himself didn't ignore, if you like, the externalities or the politics. So the argument is in simple terms, starting from perhaps Harry Brighouse's work. The central purpose of education is to promote human flourishing. Since then, there have been many debates and theories about what flourishing is. Aristotle has been a touch point for many people, including Christian Christensen, who spoke to us last term, and he continues to work. John Beale, our research assistant, our research fellow, who looks at eudaimonia, for example, continues to work in that tradition, and looking at that work again, I'm reminded, of course, that the question for Aristotle wasn't simply that flourishing or virtue occurs, simply in individual heads, but that it actually occurs within activity. And Aristotle is quite clear about perhaps making a distinction between activity as activity and what he might go on to call virtuous activity. And so there are people who concentrate on perhaps that part of the debate, and I think we came towards the end of our work last term to looking at the importance of activity, and certainly people like the Harvard School and elsewhere that work on flourishing do ask questions about settings in which activities take place. So is family a setting in which naturally occurring activity that would encompass human flourishing as a necessary condition, perhaps, for human flourishing, as a Christian would argue, given a number of characters. Some people work on leadership or on higher education or workplace settings, and ask incredibly good questions about how we might, in these settings and through human activity, virtuous activity, as some would argue, encourage flourishing. And how the role of education perhaps remains a consistently important role in different activity settings. But there are other voices that look too at flourishing and perhaps don't necessarily term it as such, but look at well-being, for example, as an argument, and the relationship between the meanings of those words suggests that they're not necessarily that far apart, although mean different things, even when one turns to Aristotle for guidance. But people like social development theorists like Nussbaum and others would argue that looking carefully at Aristotle's work is that the question of virtuous activity and therefore of settings perhaps is not in itself sufficient, and that what we need to look at are in fact the support that exists in the external environment, support with which activities or human endeavor would not, in a sense, be able to take place. So for those, Christian is one of them, and others would turn to Aristotle and say, well, Aristotle actually wrote about goods for the soul, goods for the body, external goods, resources in a sense, money, things that people need in life, without which the idea of engaging in virtuous activity in a variety of settings, in a variety of cultural arenas, wherever they might be, will, in a sense, render the entire idea perhaps more theoretical than possibly practical. So there are voices that argue for a harder look, a closer look at what we mean by goods, by these externalities that that arguably even Aristotle would have argued are important. So how does one square perhaps not just one but several circles? So for me, really, the question is, well, many questions. What are these goods and services, and even if they and whose duty is it? So there's a very interesting recent paper in the British Journal of Educational Studies. I'll give you the name in a minute. Published a year or two ago, that basically saying, Aristotle in his work on politics, in his looked at polity, looked at the external environment, looked at the question of goods, and this argument is relevant today, that if we're looking at education as a driver, education as fulfilling its purpose to enable human flourishing, then we must look at how we resource education. And ultimately, this comes down to those who control education. And back to Aristotle again. Even there, it is clear that for Aristotle, the politicians, those who or rulers, as you would call them, play an enormously important role. So the debate around human flourishing, for me, very refreshingly, is present sometimes in explicit and sometimes more implicitly in debates in a slightly wider terrain around education, wider than perhaps philosophy, wider than psychology, and indeed wider perhaps than political economy or politics. Is there a chance, perhaps in a seminar series such as the one that we are holding this year, to try and subject these different arguments, these different concepts to a framework in which they make sense, a framework that perhaps helps us and guide us not to forget not only questions of externalities, but questions of history and questions of culture. So I'm going to ask Luana whether she would mind just flashing up a single slide that I prepared for tonight, and I'll try and talk us through this slide if we can try and enlarge it a little. That would be good. Is that about what we can get? Ah, fantastic. Okay, so there's a little prism which I thought might help us on our way, and the little structures that form, that shape that prism are not necessarily in any kind of order. So I'll talk to each of those balloons, if you like, within the prism, and try and make sense of my talk. So I think we've last year as this year, for us, the question of flourishing and its importance to the question of mind or spirit in positive psychology terms, in philosophical terms, the individual in the setting, indeed even for those like Amartya Sen or Nausbaum who work on capabilities, what they would call the I capabilities, the internal human capabilities, the question of mind, our own capabilities, and what human beings are capable of if they are enabled to achieve is not unimportant. So with that in mind, and with Aristotle's and others' view in mind that actually, in order to study perhaps human flourishing, and for those who are students who read and work with methodology and methodological perspectives, the big question always is, what is the unit of analysis? What is the unit of analysis? And I think one of the dangers of a unit of analysis being an individual head, an individual mind, an individual or even collective outcome, such as wealth or health or beauty, etc. So if you look at some of Christians' categories, the 6 sort of necessities. Once these things are turned into a checklist for human flourishing, the unit of analysis, is it achieved or not achieved? Is it present or absent, etc.? I think is a bit of a risky game. Is a risky game. And my advice, really, and where I'd like to see more discussion, is to turn the unit of analysis, and certainly in this seminar series, we shall be looking very carefully at what people are saying and suggesting. But what I hope we'd want some more clarity on is whether activity settings can become units of analysis. So how do people in urban slums in Faisalabad in Pakistan, where I've spent a lot of my years, thrive and flourish and overcome the physical conditions of open drain sewers and still standing water that breeds malaria, or in a village in Africa that is where a school is separated from a home by increasingly swelling river waters that pose all sorts of dangers for children trying to get to it. So what kind of activity settings are we dealing with? There are many in many different parts of the world, in many different cultures. Is it possible, is it indeed desirable for us to look at the question of human flourishing, not as an individual or a collective outcome, something that we can tick on a tick box, but really as a study of human endeavor within an activity setting? So what is it that people do to overcome hardship, whether in urban slums, whether in abject poverty, whether in dealing with huge number of examples of adversity, mudslides, and therefore death in Sierra Leone, civil wars, ethnic conflicts and violence in Ethiopia, etc. How do people negotiate, mediate, and overcome strife and adversity of this kind? Innumerable examples. And as I said, the question is not, it is about the unit of analysis. And my argument is that a unit of analysis that looks at, for example, peace as an outcome and therefore as a construct, or forgiveness as an outcome and therefore as a construct, perhaps misses the point. It is where the best learnings lie is at the confluence of these troubled waters where streams flow together. It is about understanding the activity setting. To understand flourishing, my argument would be to understand the activity settings themselves, not necessarily their outcomes. This is not to say that people shouldn't strive for outcomes such as peace or health outcomes, or prosperity and individual wealth and collective economic success. Absolutely, and are they measures? Well, absolutely they are measures, and many global institutions spend their lifetime collecting such data and such measures and attempt to produce and project profiles of human progress on health or economy or other measures of well-being by doing precisely that. But it is when these measures either are showing on our graphs at appearing to be stagnant or appearing to be regressive. So we had peace and therefore more girls went to school in Sudan, and then low level of conflict emerged, And now we see regression on our graphs in terms of the numbers of girls in schools and their educational outcomes. We get really worried. This is, again, not an argument that we shouldn't be doing it, but if that is our focus in order to understand human flourishing, I think it would be an imperfect focus. A better focus would be if the question is, what is human flourishing and how do we enable it, that our unit of analysis is the activity setting. To come to the question that Aristotle raised and others have raised about goods for the soul and goods for the body and etc. Christians' work and the various categories that have been arrived at. I would put that into the little bubble on artifacts, resources, and tools. But I would argue, perhaps a little bit with the Harvard School, that actually those categories that are, lined up, or Christian really, rather than the Harvard School, is perhaps they don't necessarily all fit that neatly. So artifacts themselves may well be cultural artifacts, including resources such as means by which we need to live, affordable housing or employment to ensure that we're able to feed our families. But indeed, when one looks at these categories that Christian has drawn our attention to, such as parental attachment or individual wealth, a complete life, or indeed friends and family, I think the debate there is one that needs to be pushed a little further, and I would draw our attention to my little red circle there that is called mediational means. So I wouldn't myself suggest that having a supportive family, or having been, as people, Aristotle and others talk of a good upbringing, having been brought up well, having been shown, if you like, pathways towards making important moral and good and right decisions, and empathy and all the rest of it, are not necessarily goods. They are what I would call mediational means, and it is an area which I feel isn't quite as alive in the various literatures around human flourishing as we would like. So it is how do communities and how do people work in a mediated way with available resources? And so, as I suggest, the debate at the moment is quite right, that we need resources, we need goods, as Aristotle says, or as Christian 6 categories draw attention to. But we need more than goods. We really need mediational means, a way in which those goods are turned into service. No good having communities that have a bit of wealth. Flourishing doesn't necessarily follow having the means itself. It is about how those means are used and distributed in a way that is fair and equitable, and who makes those decisions. Where are the moral guides, the moral compasses? And that really sits within that bubble, if you like, on mediational means. Another word might be enablers. So who are the people in the community? What are the rules in communities, in societies? What values exist in terms of how goods or resources are used. Are we wasteful about things, or do we have a sort of social empathy? Are we aware of disparity in society, that not everyone necessarily has the same means? And certainly many arguments around human flourishing draws attention to this kind of social empathy and awareness, and indeed activities to draw people's attention to the importance of empathy, of sharing, and of being equalizers in a sense. So that would be an important avenue, and I think the argument here really is, when people ask the question, what is the purpose of education, or does education lead to human flourishing? These are pretty tight questions, and I think they're not necessarily answerable questions. And where we should be looking at the role and purpose of education is really within these bubbles. So what is the role of education in activity settings? How do we make activity settings meaningful, and what kind of education do we need there? In terms of mediational means, education itself is a mediational means, but only when it itself is properly mediated through culture, values, history, and so on. So you can see the complexity. These questions aren't simple questions. They might look like interesting questions to ask if you're trying to do a doctorate in this area, or a master's, or whatever, but the questions are hugely complex. The last two bubbles are really the question of the external environment, and I've actually split the external environment into two areas. The external environment, I think, increasingly now, and this kind of comes back to my readings from my 1899 book on the education of different groups of people in different parts of the world. Even then, the kind of global influence, the sway of education, what is right educationally, what isn't right, who should receive an education, what is this education made up of, and how does one deal with conflict? I mean, that is very much the world that we live in today. That there are very strong global influences of in a sense, the educational industry, the external environment. There are loud voices about the value and worth of vocational education. Still today, after my little reading on of the inspector in the 1900s, the World Bank blew hot and cold over vocational education in the 1970s, causing an enormous crisis for educational systems in the developing world, only because it felt it didn't meet its sort of model, its rate of return model, that it was too expensive to build schools that had machines that might teach people how to become carpenters or plumbers, and that governments would be better off investing in primary education, and primary education meant basic literacy of reading and writing for some, perhaps, with the possibility of continuity, but not for many others. So the external environment indeed frames a number of questions of what human flourishing ultimately is, and indeed, as I've said earlier, how it might be measured. And because we are dealing with big global institutions, their way, and it's not an unimportant way, of course, is to be able to document through large comparative studies and data which societies prosper more, which societies have a bigger share of the health dividend, which societies have a better handle on social democracy and the participation of women or minority groups in government, etc. And all these data become very meaningful, but they're driven by very carefully crafted questions around ideas of human flourishing, akin to ideas of human advancement, human movement, and they all seem to be pushing us towards advancement to attainable goals. Prosperity is measured in GDP. Health is measured in particular outcomes such as stunting or growth or longevity, and so on and so forth. And when governments find that they don't beg your pardon, I've got very urgent ambulances and police cars that go past my abode, chasing after people. And when these outcomes are not obtainable in the way in which governments see them to be important, they frame flourishing for collectives and individuals, sometimes in very tight ways. So for those who are students of China and educational policy there, for example, you'll be aware of the double reduction policy, where the Chinese government has basically said we had a one-child policy and a two-child policy, and our demography is shrinking, and we don't have quite as young a population as Indonesia or perhaps even the US. Forget Britain; it's got an aging population. But the economists are saying, those with young populations, with youth bulges, that kind of demographic profile is the profile you want for prosperity long into the distant future, and where governments are not able to achieve that in a natural way. They influence it, like the Chinese government through its double reduction policy, basically says private tuition, which is actually in a bizarre sort of way. I really like the policy because I think it does call time on the kinds of things that populations in China have been spending a huge amount of their resources in. Like private tuition, but in order for, from the Chinese government's point of view, to encourage parents to have more children, is to stop them from paying more private tuition fees, to reduce that burden on parents, in the hope that parents will in fact have more children because they don't have to spend their hard-earned incomes on private tuition for additional parents. Where we think of human flourishing along pathways of social democracy and social empathy and the kind of global awareness and even forgivingly UNESCO's vision of global citizenship, not my favorite sort of phrase, there are societies out there that say this isn't for us. We, like Hungary, for example, for us, singularity in terms of the nation state, in terms of what we mean by culture and how we see ourselves as a society is what drives our vision of flourishing. And that really comes down, very much what I've been talking about is the question of world view. It's about big national values, about big national perspectives of what drives us as societies, and therefore what defines our views and our visions for our population, and how flourishing, human endeavor, what human beings strive to achieve, whether through as individuals or collectives, are in many ways governed and boxed in by worldview, by the external environment, and this is why these debates become hugely important. So my argument here really is that, unless we are willing, and we're better than an Oxford seminar series, to drop preconceptions and to think, because we, those amongst us who are fortunate enough to be paid to think, and those who pay money in order to be in activity settings and environments that encourage you to think. Let's join heads, let's join minds, really to think about the landscape and how we might, get at least a broader handle on how we might treat concepts such as human flourishing, and how, even if ultimately our aim is to increase our philosophical understandings of the concept, or to increase the sharpness in our simple but clear and robust questions, such as the relationship between education and human flourishing, let's allow ourselves over these 8 weeks an opportunity to wander into a much larger landscape, to ask bigger questions, simply only to try and achieve more clarity around our own individual and specific questions about this topic. So the paper tonight is not to dissuade you from simple, robust, powerful questions, or to think within a discipline. It's simply to encourage you to use the time this term for us to think together about what other arguments might exist, and in the hope that wider arguments might sharpen the more specific questions that we wish to ask. Okay, I'll leave it there, Fiona. Thank you very much, and thanks for your patience to those on the call.
Bravo, David. Thank you very much for that wonderfully, well, typically provocative and wide-ranging start to the series. I'd like to open the floor to some questions. Just to remind you of the housekeeping here, if you could either put your question in the chat or use the hand signal, which is on the top of the bar, to indicate your interest in asking a question. So I'm sure there's some really good questions out here. Maybe I can call upon you, Jonathan. Oh, yes, excellent. Thank you very much. If you unmute, very much look forward to hearing from you. If you could give me your name, if you could give us your name as well.
So my name is Akosia, but everyone calls me Kush. And I'm so sorry for coming so late. I actually found out about this series a minute before I jumped into it. So I'm glad that I got to have the last 10 minutes. And because I missed quite a lot of the context, I'm going to ask a broad question, right? Because it seems like you like a big, the topology that you were kind of painting for us is quite broad. And I want to talk about where purpose fits into the narrative that you shared with us. So you talked about the relationship, like fulfillment and its relationship. Where would you think?
We can't hear you. Perhaps you can put your question in the chat, and I can then speak it out.
So sorry, you didn't hear me?
No, we didn't. We can hear you now.
Oh, you're joking. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
we can hear you now. I think I might have called.
Turn it off. It's my daughter. Turn it off.
I might have called.
Right. So first, I apologized for arriving so late, and I said that actually I only got the invitation a minute before I jumped on. I only got the last 10 minutes, but my question really is, how do you think purpose fits into this topology that you were just describing? So you talked a bit about fulfillment and education, but where does purpose lie in this narrative that you shared with us?
I think absolutely centrally. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. No, I think such a good question. Thank you for that. No, I think absolutely centrally to the debate. At the beginning, I sort of painted a picture of human activity in different settings, and ultimately, it is in human activity that human beings flourish. But human activity isn't just activity, it's purposeful activity. So for those who write on activity, there's actually a big school of thought called cultural, historical, and activity theory. And what underpins that school of thought is precisely the question of purpose, that it is only purposeful action or purposeful activity that brings out human flourishing. So I gave examples of the urban slums in Pakistan, but it could be the same sort of purpose that the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire was on about, and for him purpose was conscientization when he looked at Brazilian women that he was wanting to teach to read and write, and felt that you couldn't simply teach people to read "The Cat Sat on the Mat" because that has no purpose at all, but actually to show Brazilian women photographs of them with their hands in washing up suds when they do the laundry or the dishes calls into question immediately at the start of that literacy lecture the question of purpose. What is your purpose in life? Where would you want to get to? The drudge of washing up. And it is around that Paulo Freire built his educative model. So purpose is absolutely central to human activity. Without purpose, flourishing within activity, that Aristotle might have, drawn our attention to, would be meaningless. And that's precisely the kind of question that my sort of provocative talk tonight hopes to elicit. Purpose is absolutely central. So well done, fantastic question.
Well, we have another. Sorry, continue.
I was just going to say, I really love this idea of meaning as a bridge. So purpose being what brings meaning to activity, which therefore the fulfillment. So it's the bridge between the fulfillment. It's what gets you to fulfillment in activity through work. So I like that.
Absolutely. Fantastic.
So we have a question in the chat from Rosemary, who asks, when you talk about the relationship of education and flourishing, how do you define education, and what kind of education are you referring to?
Okay, just switching over to the chat. Okay, so what relation? How do you define education? I think this was another attempt at provocation, Rosemary, and I was essentially saying that education has been defined in so many different ways, and that if we don't look at the history of the definition of education, that's why I sort of read a little bit from these 19th century texts from school inspectors in schools in the colonies. They were quite clear that education had a very narrow purpose. For some to Christianize, for others, a variety of things. And I have to say that many of those views themselves were driven by 18th century, 19th century philosophers, not necessarily thinking about as the reading went, the Aboriginal kids or those in Sri Lanka, but just the idea. I mean, the other book I was going to read from is this little text. You can't see it, but written in the 1800s, called "The Lamplighter," which is really about orphan girls in 18th century Britain, and in a sense, when people said the only way that they could achieve meaning in their lives was through education. And it's interesting, in this Lamplighter, I came across the famous Tony Blair words: "Our purpose is to educate, educate, educate." But what we've kind of lost a little bit is precisely your question, Rosemary. What do we mean by educate? And that is why I said we must look back at the trajectories of education and its meaning, and how those meanings have shifted, and indeed how those meanings have been contested. So it's not just educate, 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 or education as an unproblematic construct, or indeed as a huge, forgive the word, but industry, or something that we live with. It's never been uncontested, and it will continue to be contested. And so the question is a good one. What do we mean, and how do we define education? That has always been contested, and let's not lose sight of that, of the historical trajectories, the historical contestations. We still fight about the meaning of education, what is right for our time, and the fight, that particular question, what is right for us, what is right for our time, and what is right for our future, has been contested, way back, for girls and boys in whatever context they found themselves. And some contested it simply by voting with their feet. Schools were built, they just didn't turn up. They said, what you're trying to teach us is hopeless. We're not going to be stitching embroidery, etc. What purpose does that serve, and so on. So the purposes have always been contested. suppose the answer is, how do you define it? Is what is, first of all, my point about ask questions about this, don't take it at face value. We can't simply ask the question, what is the purpose of education and is it a driver for human flourishing, without asking your question, Rosemary, how do we define education? What is it? And is it indeed right for us, for our time?
Super, thank you, David. Can I pass the mic over to Ellen from TWCF?
You're muted, Ellen. Ellen, you're muted.
Do you want to try again, Ellen? We still can't hear you. So, okay, well, maybe we'll move back to you. Oh gosh, would you, Akusha, okay. Okay, Emily, I think you put your...
Hello?
Emily, we pass the microphone over to you and then we'll go back to Ellen. You're on mute, Emily.
All right, it keeps.
We can hear you now.
Okay, yeah. So I was saying thank you. I've been very, I've listened throughout and learned a lot. And also, I mean, what it made, I'm not sure whether I have a question, but it's comments about, it raised in my mind, or it awakened the lecture that I gave last time on the system of education in Kenya and how it has gone through several phases, starting with colonial education, the emphasis that was given, exactly like what you are reading about Ceylon and maybe Canada, and yeah, maybe other parts of the colonies as well. And so how that kind of activity of emphasis on industrial education was, it seems activity is okay, but since it was differentiated so that it was only given to the natives, and for the ones, there was another type of elite education that was given to those ruling class, so there was so that differentiation seems to have caused those who are being given to see that it was inferior, or it was seen as inferior to them, and they contested, and of course built their own schools, and decided that they needed a type of education. And so that is when in independence, now the education that came in was now more academic rather than emphasis on the skills and the industrial type. And then now again a shift after a period of time. There's been a shift back to that kind of education, even in the modern now. This we are now going through, I think it's about 6 years now, the competency-based curriculum, trying to emphasize competencies rather than just academic knowledge. Yeah. So I do not know. I think it is just seeing that the context is very important in showing what human flourishing is with regard to education. I just want to emphasize, and to affirm you on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, I think it's absolutely brilliant, and yeah, you know, this is the problem we had. As you say, that it was a two-tier system, and because it was so highly based on selection, certainly in colonial Africa and colonial South Asia, they selected those who would get an academic education, who would become the sort of you know, the local people who looked after the interests of the crown, as it were. So for people receiving a vocational education, that was absolutely, as you say, seen to be second class. So when the debate about and what is really interesting is, of course, you know, Chinese influence on, I think Tanzania was a very important, interesting case study when Julius Nyerere became president. He was very influenced by Mao Zedong and the conception, actually, that there should be no separation between mental work and manual work. And so in Nyerere's schools, there were very much, you know, I spoke about the gardens in Ceylon, but it was very much that children learned their ABCs and their 1, 2, 3s, but they also learned how to plant and reap and sow and to build. And the conception, you know, Mao's vision, which was what China had at the time, was really that education was shifted to the benefit of the peasant classes, and this is what Nyerere learned and tried to build that system. You know, ultimately people look back and say, well, this was a failed experiment, but the Mao's ideal of no separation between mental and manual work was an important ideal. It's one that Germany has been very successful at. So Germany's two-tier educational system, where there's no shame in working for Mercedes-Benz or in high-tech industry. But of course, Germany's history isn't Kenya's history, and that sort of blemishing of vocational education as it was in Africa, because it created two different classes, wasn't in a sense Germany's history. And that's why, you know, my argument tonight is about the importance of history, the importance of understanding the historical trajectory of education in different contexts, to understand how people you know, understand within themselves the idea of flourishing. So for somebody to aspire to a white-collared job in Kenya or Ethiopia or Botswana is a hugely important individual trajectory towards flourishing. And a lot of that bears a very deep relationship to the history of education in these countries. So a fantastically made point, and thank you for reinforcing that. I think.
Thank you. Ellen has written her question in the chat, and I'll read that out. So she says, my question relates to how to go about answering one of the questions you posed early on. Specifically, you challenged us to explore how people overcome and thrive in the face of adverse conditions. To a certain extent, the field of resilience studies is trying to tackle this question. What do you feel is needed to broaden the research agenda to explore this more fully? Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Ellen. What a fantastic question. I think we should abolish chat functions in Teams because people ask such fantastically well-framed questions on the chat. But this is a hugely well-framed question, and I think, you know, precisely as you say, and I think, you know, why I made the remark about adversity and about resilience. I think my remark is very much that we know, you know, practically, intuitively, academically about this fascinating human spirit in the most trying, the hardest conditions that we can imagine. Communities draw together and they work their way through it. Now, not, you know, very often there is no anthropologist on site to document it. There's no development worker on site to document it. And it is essentially what people do, what that endeavor is really my argument about what becomes the unit of analysis. So how to broaden the research agenda is really, for me, in a sense, to shift the focus of the unit of analysis to, you know, the outcome per se, although the outcome is important. So, for example, people who work on transitional justice would say, we're very happy when communities have got together in their little groups, whatever they called, and have worked out the source of conflict between them. So Group A agreed with Group B that they wouldn't go in the dead of the night and steal their cattle, and Group B has agreed not to, you know, to disarm and not to retaliate or whatever it is. And so that outcome is important, and who can deny it? But if for many people that is, you know, a study on human flourishing, on human activity that has had a meaningful outcome. What we often lose, I suppose, my argument is that we don't know enough about what happens in the settings themselves. And very often in these most trying conditions, the resolutions and the you know, the method of resolving things is just not that is not simple. One of the people I looked at very carefully, sort of hoping that we might look more at his work this term, is a man called Gustav Jehoda, who's a cultural psychologist, and he worked in Ghana. And he turned up. He was an anthropologist and spoke to people. And he was interested in the fact that a lot of people that he spoke to in Ghana said, "Oh well, you know, we." He asked people why are some children called by days of the week? So some children were called Monday, and others were called Tuesday, and others were called Wednesday. And basically, people said that. It is children were called. Well, I mean, let me say this. So after hearing these views, Gustav was basically, people said that they were named on the day of the week they were born, and people were fearful that the day of the week they were born would ultimately mark the child as being. So, for example, Monday's child was thought to be a peaceful child and would be peaceful throughout their life. And Wednesday's child was believed to be aggressive and a troublemaker. So Gustav basically went to the courts, the juvenile court records in Ghana, and found that Monday's children appeared on the records less significantly than other children. And Wednesday's children, children who were born on a Wednesday, were significantly more likely to have committed crimes against the person. So for the people in Ghana, Gustav thought he had shown the effects of labeling on children. But for the people in Ghana, they basically said, what your research has shown us is that our beliefs, our cultural beliefs, are correct. So you have basically two competing perspectives on what the issues are within the social settings. I hope I'm making sense, Ellen. So in a sense, if our agendas are in terms of well-being or peace or overcoming adversity, narrowly constructed without taking into account the debates within the setting itself, we may very well miss these very important insights that a study of the activity setting and social setting itself can contribute and add to our meaning of what human flourishing, what human overcoming, and what human endeavor ultimately mean.
Very rich answer.
It's a rich question.
So, final question to Akusa. We're close to the end of our time, but I think we can go a few minutes over due to my technical missteps. So, Akusa, over to the mic's in your hands.
Thank you. So I should say that I'm Ghanaian, David, and I'm very interested in the cultural background of this particular researcher. And I think actually this problem that you've identified links quite nicely to the second question about the definition of education that we're going to use in the next 8 weeks. There is a sense in which whatever definition we use is going to pull us in certain directions, and it's going to be more challenging to have a deep and meaningful conversation if we aren't really clear on what the items of investigation are. So I think even just a broad view or conception of what education is would be, and I'm sure it will unfold as we have these conversations. But just as a bit of cultural context, I don't know this researcher, but my name is Akosi, it means Sunday born. My daughter's Amma, means Saturday born. Nobody in my family ever calls me Akosia. They always call me by my middle name. So in Ghana, culturally, it's your middle name that's the unique signifier. And your middle name has all this kind of deep significance. And mine is Nyamiche, which means gift from God, because my mum tried, it was very difficult to have me, and it was like a blessing. So it's quite interesting within the family context, no one calls you by your day name. It's only in Europe where the practice is not it's not clearly visible in the European context that you can be called Akosia, and it appears to be a identifying marker. So I'm very interested in this research. Maybe I'll have a look. So what I wanted to share was actually in relation to what you said about meaning and how significant meaning is as the bridge. And it seems to me that meaning and the frameworks that we use to apply meaning is going to be the key to whatever discussion that you have about the bridge between fulfillment and education, right? So what is the meaning of education, which goes beyond its function? And different cultures, different contexts are going to apply different meanings, and it's going to change and it's going to evolve or whatever. But it's understanding, Bob. It's understanding the frameworks with which we attach meaning to education, the value of education that's going to determine its kind of its relationship to its relationship to fulfillment. I had another kind of comment, which is about what you said about embroidery. Which I think so it's kind of meandering thoughts, but with the embroidery, we were talking about the kind of the academic versus the vocational, And there was a little bit of that kind of bias in your description when you're talking about embroidery as not being almost not being significant. In a way, you said that, why is that useful? Well, it really depends on the meaning that we attach to that activity. So there you're revealing something about the way you understand the meaning of that activity. Actually, for some people, it might be fantastically meaningful, in which case it would be a vehicle for flourishing. So there's a lot there. I'm really interested and excited about the next couple of weeks, what we'll discover together, but just some reflections and possibly a question in some of those meandering thoughts.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. And I've traveled through many parts of Africa, and Ghana isn't where I have yet landed, and I'm begging people for an invitation. But I've managed to get the current Minister of Energy, who was also formerly the Minister of Education. He's coming to Oxford in the next few weeks, and he'll be joining us.
Invite you.
So you have here in public an invitation to dinner, and do bring your daughter along, and we can talk more about that. But absolutely, so happy to talk more about Jehoda, and really just the point. I think my reading from the sort of 19th century text was really, and I support this inspector who was saying, you can't simply bring embroidery from Britain and dressmaking to what was then called Ceylon, because although there is virtue in industrial work, in vocational work, these girls themselves, they do embroidery better than the teachers who are trying to teach it to them in school, because they sort of learn it from their parents and they absolutely live it. But she was sort of saying, if you really want vocational education to be meaningful in the context of Ceylon as it was then let them do some other vocational work, because the material that they are using and what the patterns that you're using to try and teach them are hopeless for the kind of market. They're not going to be able to make anything of their lives as they do. So it wasn't sort of me saying embroidery has no worth. It was just in a sense, I support what this inspector was saying. You know, if the Crown thought that vocational education was right, yes, okay, you know, that is maybe acceptable, but not just any old curriculum. Let's think more carefully about what is meaningful in the context of people's lives, in the context of future markets, and what they might do with those skills. So sorry if it came across as something else. But fantastic. Thank you very much for your thoughts there, and to everyone who's asked a question tonight. And we clearly have quite a lot to talk about, and I certainly will come back next week, if you allow me, when I introduce our speaker, maybe just to talk for 2 or 3 minutes about you know, how do we define education, and hopefully bring a bit more clarity to that question. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, David, for a terrific start to the series for this year, and for a very provocative and interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. See you next week.
We hope to see